Okay, thank you, Deputy. All right, please be seated. The state may call its next witness.
This time the state calls Eric Koeppen.
Okay, good afternoon. Please stand in back of the witness chair. Raise your right hand. Do you swear under penalty of perjury that you will truthfully testify?
I do.
Please have a seat. Remove your mask. And then state your full name and spell it.
My name is Eric Koeppen, and last name is spelled Koeppen.
Okay, a couple of things to keep in mind when you're testifying. Yes or no answers because of the court reporter. No or nodding your head.
Sounds good. Thank you.
If there's an objection, stop talking immediately and don't answer unless I tell you to. If you don't understand a question, let the lawyer know. And two people can't be talking at the same time. So wait until the question's finished before you answer.
Okay.
All right. Counsel?
Mr. Koeppen, could you state your occupation for the record?
I work as a forensic scientist in the biology section of the BCA laboratory.
How long have you been employed in the biology section of the BCA?
I've been employed there since February 2017.
About 4.5 years then?
That is correct.
And what are your current duties in the biology section?
As a forensic scientist, we examine items of evidence, process that item of evidence for any sort of biological fluid, do examinations, take notes on that item, make any collections. We'll then process that item for DNA profiling, make any comparisons to known samples provided in that case, write up a report, do reviews on other scientists' work, and then testify in court as needed.
What is your educational background to do such things?
In 2013, I graduated from Hamlin University with a Bachelor's of Science in Biology. I also graduated with a Forensic Science Certificate from Hamlin in 2013 as well.
Have you received any specialized training since your employment at the BCA?
Yes. Upon my employment at the BCA, we are placed into a training program. This takes about a year. You are expected to observe other scientists in the laboratory, attend classroom lectures, perform written and oral examinations, and then complete a competency test at the end of our training.
And are you evaluated after that competency test? Are you evaluated regularly to verify your proficiency in conducting your work?
Yes, we take what are called proficiency tests. Those are twice a year. They're used to kind of examine our workflow and make sure that we get the correct results of the test.
And you've testified as an expert before, correct?
That is correct.
All right. Now, before we talk about the DNA testing you performed in this case, would you please explain to the jury quickly what DNA is?
So DNA is a chemical or a molecule that's found within the cells. It kind of is the makeup of who we are as a person. Gives you your hair color, your eye color, things of that nature. It's highly unique to certain individuals besides twins.
Is it possible to identify, besides twins, the DNA of a particular person?
Yes, it is.
When you identify the DNA of a particular person, do you have a name for that result?
We would call that a match.
A match. Oh, I'm sorry, but just the actual, what's it called, DNA profile? Is that of an individual? Is that what that's called?
At the end of our testing, we do obtain, yes, a DNA profile.
Profile of a specific individual, for example.
Of an individual, or generally after the end of our testing, it's an unknown profile until we make our comparisons.
Okay. Now, is it possible then to distinguish the DNA profile of one person from the DNA profile of another person?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, is it possible to compare the DNA of a known donor with the DNA found in an unknown sample containing DNA to determine whether that person's DNA matches the DNA profile found in the sample?
Yes, sir.
Is that sort of the middle of the road, what you do on a daily basis, sir?
Yes, I could agree with that.
What is a single source DNA profile?
So a single source profile is one that we determine to be coming from a single individual. We determine this since you get half of your DNA from your mother and half of your DNA from your father. At most, at the locations that we're testing, we would expect 2 types. If there are more than 2 types at a location, then we can call that a mixture of DNA.
So when you do have 2 single-source DNA profiles, given the unique nature of them, are you able to determine if those 2 profiles are a match or not a match?
Yes.
What other types of DNA results do you expect to find besides a single-source result?
Like I stated earlier, we do end up getting mixtures of DNA where there's multiple contributors to that sample. There are often times where we get samples that we're unable to make any sort of identification to.
Is testing a sample of blood recovered from a scene something you do on a regular basis?
Yes, it is.
Are you typically able to recover DNA from swabbing the blood sample?
Yes.
And when you test blood samples, are they typically single-source profiles?
Yes.
But they could be mixtures.
That is correct.
All right. And you'll be able to determine that whether it's a single source or a mixture based on the DNA profile you receive, correct?
Correct. During our interpretation is when we'd be making that determination if it's a single source or a mixture.
Okay, I just want to move now on to the testing that you perform at the BCA. Based on your training and experience, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the DNA testing methods used at the BCA are generally accepted in the scientific community?
Yes, they are.
Does the BCA have a particular protocol or methodology that is used when performing DNA testing?
Yes.
Okay. And can you explain briefly the DNA testing policy?
Yes.
Or process, I should say.
Process, sure. DNA profiling is done generally into 4 steps. The first step is extraction. We'll get a sample subjected to certain chemicals to help break up the cellular material and release that DNA into a solution. We'll then purify that solution to get that extract of DNA, so that purified DNA. This will bring us to our next step, which is quantitation. We'll see how much DNA is present within that extract and see if it's suitable to move forward in the profiling process. If it does meet a certain threshold, it moves forward to the next step, which is called amplification. We'll be targeting certain areas of that DNA for identification purposes, and we'll be focusing on those areas, making millions upon millions of copies of that area or those areas. And then once that is completed, the final step is interpretation, where that basically that sample is injected into our instrumentation. A profile is then generated. We'll then basically visualize that profile and make our interpretations.
Okay. Now I have a couple of questions about items which are collected and inventoried at the BCA. When an item is collected, are they typically given both a BCA lab item number and a description of what the item actually is?
Yes. When items are submitted, they're given a BCA lab item number, as well as a description that's provided by the agency.
So if you take an item out of the vault, you're going to have an opportunity to see both the item's lab number and then that description of the item.
Generally, the description is not written on the item itself. However, it is in our laboratory information management system, so I'll be able to see that on the computer, yes.
Okay. And those numbers and descriptions typically would be provided by the scientist or agent who collected or inventoried those items, correct?
That is correct.
All right. And those numbers and descriptions, do you utilize those when you issue a report about your findings?
Yes.
Okay. And that's done, obviously, to aid anyone reading it?
That is correct.
All right. Now I want to move on to the testing you did in this case. Did you generate a report documenting the testing that you performed?
Yes, I did.
Were certain items of evidence in connection with this investigation inventoried at the lab?
Yes.
Did that include a blood stain or sample from a known individual named Daunte Wright?
Yes.
And that blood stain was identified as BCA item 30?
That is correct.
Were there also a series of swabs taken from blood droplets located in this case?
Yes, sir.
And of the items, would you agree that based on the item number and the description provided to you, they are the following? Item 22, that's blood from the vehicle's driver's seat. Item 25, blood from the vehicle's front passenger dashboard. Item 26, blood from a vehicle's passenger side headliner. And then item 27, blood from the vehicle's rear driver's seat.
Yes.
All right. So you obtained those swabs to conduct testing on them.
That is correct.
And did the known swab of Daunte Wright give you a full DNA profile?
Yes, it did.
And were you able to obtain separate DNA profiles from those 4 swabs of blood?
Yes.
Okay. And of those 4 DNA profiles, Am I correct that each one was a single source DNA profile?
Yes, you are correct.
All right. Did you compare the DNA profile from each blood sample to the DNA profile of Daunte Wright?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And are you prepared here to report the result for each?
Yes.
All right. Let's start with the first one, item 22, blood from the driver's seat. What was the result of your testing?
So blood from the driver's seat, item 22, was a single source male DNA profile. That male profile matched Mr. Wright's, and that profile would not be expected to occur more than once among unrelated individuals in the world population.
Okay. Next, item 25, that's the blood from the vehicle's front passenger dashboard. What was your result there?
So from the front vehicle dashboard to passenger side, it was a single source profile. It was an unidentified female profile. It did not match Mr. Wright's, and there were no further comparisons on that profile.
Were you provided any DNA samples from any other known individuals?
No, I was not.
So you had no DNA profile from an individual named Delana Albrecht Payton?
No, I was not.
Okay. Item 26, blood found on the front, the passenger side headliner.
Item 26 was also a single source male DNA profile. That single source profile matched Mr. Wright's, and once again, that profile is not expected to occur more than once among unrelated individuals in the world population.
And then item 27, blood from a vehicle's rear driver's seat.
Item 27 was a single source male DNA profile, matched Mr. Wright's, would not be expected to occur more than once among unrelated individuals in the world population.
Okay. I'm now going to show you a series of photographs already admitted as evidence in this case. Could you please show Exhibit 191? I'm showing you Exhibit 191. Do you see a sticker on there which states 22?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Could you go to the next Exhibit 192? And you'd agree that there's a sticker on the front seat there that says 22?
Yes.
All right. And based on your training and experience, to what would you conclude that this 22 corresponds?
This number 22 corresponds to item 22, which I previously reported.
Okay. And that report was that it was a match of Daunte Wright's DNA profile?
That is correct.
Okay. Next, please show Exhibit 193. And then move on to Exhibit 194. Would you agree that Exhibit 194 shows an item 25?
Yes, sir.
Based on your training and experience, would you assume that this corresponds to the item number 25 that you tested?
Yes.
And this was the DNA profile that was a match for an unidentified female?
It was an unidentified female profile.
Okay. Next, Exhibit 195. And then, can you see the item 26 on the roof of that vehicle, sir?
Yes, I can.
Okay, and then go to Exhibit 196. And based on your training experience, do you believe that this was the lab item number you tested that was number 26?
Yes.
And am I right that the result of your testing showed that blood was also a match for Daunte Wright's DNA profile?
That is correct.
Okay. And then finally, please show Exhibit 197. And then move to 198. I'm showing you an item, if you could zoom in on that, Mr. Miller. I'm showing you Exhibit 198. Would you agree, if we close up there, that it shows item number 27?
Yes.
And based on your training experience, are you to believe that that is a match for that is the blood sample that you tested as lab item number 27?
Yes.
And that, too, was a match for Daunte Wright's DNA profile? Correct?
That is correct.
All right. You can take that down. So to summarize your findings, of those 4 blood items, 3 of them were a match for Daunte Wright, and that 4th one on the passenger dashboard was from an unknown female DNA profile. Right?
That is correct.
Okay. No further questions.
You may step down. The state may call its next witness.
This time the state calls Travis Melland.
Good afternoon. Please step forward. Stand behind the witness chair. And raise your right hand. Do you swear under penalty of perjury that you will truthfully testify in connection with this trial?
I do.
Please have a seat. Remove your mats, please, and then state your full name and spell it.
Travis Melland, Melland.
All right. There's a court reporter taking down everything that is being said in the courtroom. Yes or no, and start shaking your head, right? No, or wait until the question's finished before you answer, so two people are not speaking at the same time. If an objection is made, stop talking. Don't answer it unless I tell you to, okay? And if you don't understand a question, of course, let the lawyer know, all right? Counsel?
Mr. Melland, could you please state your occupation for the record?
I'm a forensic scientist for the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
How long have you worked for the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension Crime Lab?
For approximately 6 years now.
Could you discuss your current duties with the Crime Lab?
Sure, my current duties are to compare ammunition components found at a scene to each other or to a firearm if it was recovered.
And how many years have you been doing that sort of work in the Firearms Lab?
I've been with the Firearms Lab for about 5 years now.
Okay. Could you discuss your education and training to conduct such comparative analysis?
Yes, first I earned my Bachelor of Science in Forensic Biochemistry back in 2014. Once hired at the BCA in the Firearms Laboratory, we go through a year-long extensive training module in which we learn about the different makes and models of firearms, their history, how they operate, and then also with ammunition components and how they interact with those different firearms. And then we go through and hundreds of different ammunition components and gain that cognitive ability, what constitutes an identification versus an elimination from a firearm.
Okay. And as part of the BCA's yearly evaluation process, are you evaluated regularly every year to verify your proficiency in this sort of work?
Yes, we go through annual proficiency tests in the Firearms Lab.
And have you testified in court as an expert before?
Yes, I have.
Okay. I'd like to talk generally about the background underlying firearms examinations. When an individual loads a semi-automatic firearm with ammunition, do you have a name for that type of ammunition, for a live round of ammunition?
Oh, yeah, a live round would be considered a cartridge.
Okay. What are the component parts of a cartridge?
So a cartridge is comprised of a projectile, commonly a bullet, with a propellant or the gunpowder inside, an ignition source, which would be the primer end of the cartridge, all housed within a metal casing.
Okay. And the casing being the fourth, right?
Casing is the fourth part, correct.
All right. Now, when the gun fires, what happens to the component parts of the cartridge?
So when a semi-automatic firearm is discharged, the primer portion, which contains the ignition source of the cartridge, is struck by the firing pin. It creates an impression on that cartridge case, and then creates an exponential amount of gas and pressure. This allows the bullet to then travel down the barrel and out the muzzle of the firearm, picking up rifling characteristics from that firearm, as well as pressing against the breech face or the rear end of the firearm as well, before it is then ejected from the firearm.
Okay. When you conduct a firearms comparison, what items or components are you typically examining and comparing as part of your work?
Typically, we are looking at cartridge cases and bullets.
Okay. How does the examination of discharged cartridge casings and fired bullets enable you to draw conclusions about the use of specific firearms?
So when a firearm is discharged and those components interact with that firearm, it picks up markings from that firearm that we can use and look at under a comparative microscope to make an identification or elimination or some conclusion.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what class characteristics and individual characteristics are?
Yes, so class characteristics are those that are predetermined by the manufacturer. For example, these include the caliber or the size of ammunition that the firearm takes, the size of the rifling or the grooves cut inside the barrel, the directionality of the rifling of the barrel, along with the firing pin shape, the shape of the aperture in which the firing pin goes through on the firearm, and as well as the finishing of the breech face that the cartridge case will press up against as well. If any one of these class characteristics differ, we can eliminate those components from being fired from that particular firearm. Individual characteristics are incidental to the manufacturing process and are more of the microscopic detail that are created through the manufacturing process, but also through the use, abuse, wear, and tear of the firearm itself.
Okay. And in terms of individual characteristics then, does comparing these enable you to draw conclusions about when a specific firearm was used?
Correct. We use individual characteristics for our conclusions.
Okay. I want to zero in just on discharge cartridge casings. I think you've talked about where specific markings are left on these cartridges when they're fired and ejected. Because of those marks left on the discharge cartridge casings, that's how you can compare and identify when they're ejected from a particular firearm?
That's correct.
Okay. And you can compare two discharge cartridge casings which are fired from different guns?
Yes, we could.
Okay. And that's using your sort of comparison microscope?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, let's say you only recover a single discharge cartridge casing and a single firearm. Are you able to somehow evaluate whether the discharge cartridge casing was fired from the gun?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Could you explain to the jury how that's done?
So we evaluate the firearm for those class characteristics. If all the class characteristics are in line with what we're seeing on our evidence cartridge case, then we can move on to test firing that firearm. And then we collect cartridge cases that we know of came from that firearm, as well as bullets during this process. Then we can physically compare the cartridge case known from the firearm to the evidence cartridge case collected at the scene.
Okay, so you do eventually do sort of an apples and apples comparison against discharge cartridge casings. It's just that you know the test fired one came from a particular firearm. Is that all right?
That is correct.
All right. Now, when you conduct your work on a given case, does your work go through a verification process?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And that requires another forensic scientist to examine your work and to evaluate your conclusions?
Correct. Another examiner trained and also signed off in the same discipline will verify by our conclusions.
Okay. So that's discharge cartridge casings. Now let's talk about fired bullets. If you only have a fired bullet and a particular firearm, do you have to go through a comparable test firing and recover a test fired bullet to conduct a comparison?
Yes, similar to cartridge cases, we'll evaluate for class characteristics, and then if those are in alignment, then we go through and test fire, and we'll compare those known bullets from the firearm to the bullets if they were collected at the scene.
Sure. And this question might be just 1 + 1 is 2, but if you have a single bullet, single firearm, and a single discharge cartridge casing, you can compare all three items together, correct?
We only compare to a firearm. There's no way for us to compare a particular bullet from coming from a particular cartridge case.
You need the firearm for the test-fired bullet and the DCC, right?
That is correct.
Okay, I want to move on to the testing you did in this case. Did you receive a request to examine evidence?
Yes, it was.
And was that request made by Agent Mike Phil?
Yes, it was.
All right. With regard to the work performed here, were you asked to retrieve certain items of evidence which had been collected and inventoried at the BCA?
Yes.
Okay. Of the items, am I correct that you obtained 3 items?
That is correct.
All right. And when you obtained those items, they were assigned a lab number?
That is correct.
All right. And you generated a report based on your work in this case, correct?
And that is correct.
All right. And those 3 items that you got were item 7, that was a single 9mm discharge cartridge casing that was collected by Melissa Loren. Item 13, which is a Glock 7 9mm firearm, which was item number 13. And then item 31, a projectile or fired bullet, item 31. Is that correct?
That does sound correct.
Okay. So the purposes of your testimony today, we can agree that you got a single discharge cartridge case and a single bullet and then the firearm.
That's correct.
And you were asked to compare them.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, before we talk about your results, I just want to make sure that we're talking about the same items. Permission to approach the witness, Your Honor. Mr. Melland, I'm showing you exhibits 199, 202, and 200. I'll show them to you each. I'm showing you exhibit 200. Would you agree that is the discharge cartridge casing?
Yes, it is.
Exhibit 202. What? Pardon me. Item 201. You recognize this as the fired bullet?
Yes, I do.
And then exhibit 199. Exhibit Cramel item number 13. You recognize this as the firearm?
Yes, I do.
Were you able to compare the discharge cartridge casing to the firearm?
Yes, I was.
Did you follow the same method and procedure that you discussed a few minutes ago?
Yes, I did.
And what was your result?
I concluded that the fired cartridge case and the bullet covering the scene were fired by the firearm in this case.
I'm sorry, you might have went beyond my question. I just asked about the discharge cartridge casing. Did you also make a similar conclusion about the fired bullet?
My apologies. Yes, I did.
Okay. So in the end, your findings are that that firearm fired the DCC and fired the fired bullet in this case.
That's correct.
All right. Now, I have a couple additional questions about the firearm. Did you conduct an examination of the firearm as to its functionality?
Yes, I did.
All right. And did you confirm that it was functional?
Yes, I did.
As part of your examination, were you able to examine an aspect of the firearm called trigger pull?
Yes, I was.
What is trigger pull?
In short, the trigger pull is the force necessary to pull the trigger or fire the gun.
All right. There's a phrase some laymen use, dropping the hammer. Have you heard of this phrase?
Yeah, more commonly with revolvers. But
Okay.
yes.
Well, that's what we're talking about. How much weight does it take to fire the gun?
That's correct.
Can you tell? Can you measure how that is? How much weight that takes?
Yes, we can.
Could you describe for the jury how that's done?
So we have a static weight apparatus in which we can hang known weights and poundages and hang that off of the trigger of a firearm. We measure to a point of which we can lift up on the firearm and not have the trigger get depressed consistently, and then also keep adding weight until we're consistently getting the trigger to depress, and we create a range of what that trigger pull would be.
Now, is there a typical range for force required to pull the trigger of any firearm? Typical range?
Yes, in my experience, anywhere between 3 and 9 pounds is fairly average.
Okay, so in this case, were you able to measure the trigger pull of Exhibit 199?
Yes, I was.
Right. And what were the results there?
It was approximately 5.5 to 6 pounds.
Okay, so within the normal range.
That is correct.
Okay, no further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Kratz? Oh, you may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, there's no further witnesses this afternoon.
Okay. All right. Okay, members of the jury, we're going to stop early today, okay? And we'll start up at 9 o'clock. All right. I want to assure you that we're still on schedule, okay? All right. So have a great evening. Council, please be seated. All right. The state filed 2 motions. I'm wondering whether the defense wishes to put in a written motion or just do oral argument on them.
Oral argument.
Okay. All right. Let's start up at 9 o'clock. I'll review the state's motions tonight, and maybe we can discuss them tomorrow. Okay? Is there anything else we need to put on the record?
On the record, no, but the state does wish to be heard in chambers with regard to an issue.
Right now?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Come on back.